The music hall froze in collective shock. Standing under the glaring golden lights of the Sapphire Grand Stage was Samuel Brooks, the elderly janitor in his faded gray uniform, caught with his hand lightly brushing the gleaming surface of the Bosendorfer grand piano, an untouchable symbol of prestige reserved for the most celebrated artists. "You there," a sharp voice cut through the stunned silence like a knife. Vivian Lancaster, radiant in an icy blue gown, her platinum curls shimmering under the chandeliers, stormed forward, her expression twisted in contempt. "What do you think you're doing? That piano is worth more than your entire life." A wave of cold, pitiless laughter rippled through the backstage crowd. Smartphones were raised, ready to capture the humiliation of a man who was supposed to be invisible. Samuel's hand recoiled instantly, as if he had been burned. He bowed his head low, his voice trembling. "I'm sorry, Miss Lancaster. I was just making sure." "Making sure?" Vivian barked a laugh that dripped with scorn. "Your job is to push that cart, mop the floors, and stay out of sight. Not to lay your filthy hands on something you'll never understand." The laughter grew louder. Samuel's cart squeaked as he backed away, his wrinkled hands gripping the handle tighter, his chest constricted with a pain too old and too deep to explain. To them, he was nothing. As Samuel disappeared into the shadows, the glamorous world of the Sapphire Music Hall resumed as if nothing had happened, but beneath its polished marble and velvet seats, something had already shifted. Something irreversible. Earlier that evening, the hall had been alive with excitement. Limousines gleamed under the moonlight, spilling out men in black tuxedos and women adorned in glittering evening dresses. Inside, rows of navy velvet seats awaited the crème de la crème of New Orleans society, elite sponsors, world-renowned critics, and the heirs of generational wealth. At the center of it all stood the Bosendorfer grand piano, its polished surface gleaming like a pool of black glass. It was more than an instrument. It was a throne, and only royalty could touch it. Vivian Lancaster embodied that royalty. At 17, she was a phenomenon, hailed as the Swan of the South, daughter of media mogul Richard Lancaster, and winner of 5 state-level music competitions. Every movement she made, every note she played, was the embodiment of perfection. And she knew it. Backstage, the young prodigies buzzed around her like lesser stars around the sun. Some whispered words of admiration. Others offered cautious smiles. Vivian paid them no mind. None of them mattered. She was the center. The destined legend. Her fingers rehearsed the concerto in the air, flawless, mechanical, even as her mind wandered to the shining Bosendorfer waiting under the lights. That piano was her domain tonight. Nothing and no one was allowed to taint it. And yet, as she turned toward the stage, she had seen it, the old janitor, his gnarled hand touching the sacred piano as if he had any right. Disgust had flared instantly. And so she had acted publicly, cruelly, to remind everyone of the hierarchy they all lived under. There were stars, and there were shadows. There was Vivian Lancaster, and there were people like Samuel Brooks. But what Vivian didn't realize, what none of the glittering guests or polished critics understood, was that Samuel Brooks had once sat under lights just as bright, at a piano just as grand. He had once been more than just a shadow. As the backstage laughter faded into rehearsed scales and murmured conversations, Samuel leaned against a darkened wall, the coldness of the marble seeping into his bones. He closed his eyes, letting the cruelty of the moment wash over him. It wasn't the first time. He had endured countless indignities, small, sharp cuts of indifference from the rich, the beautiful, the powerful. But tonight, something inside him stirred. An ache deeper than humiliation. A whisper of defiance. Samuel opened his eyes slowly, his gaze traveling toward the stage where the Bosendorfer sat gleaming in the golden light, untouched, waiting. Waiting. He pushed his cart aside, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and something else he hadn't felt in years, resolve. The world had forgotten Samuel Brooks. But Samuel Brooks had not forgotten the music. And tonight, in front of those who had mocked him, he would remind them, not with anger, not with vengeance, but with the only language he had ever truly spoken. Music. The old janitor took a step forward, the echoes of laughter fading behind him, the polished marble stretching out before him like a path to destiny. The night was far from over. The true performance had yet to begin. The echoes of cruel laughter still hung in the air as Samuel Brooks disappeared behind the heavy velvet curtains, pushing his battered cleaning cart with slow, trembling hands. His face, aged by time and weariness, remained lowered, the sting of humiliation heavier than the burden of all his years of labor. Behind him, Vivian Lancaster's sharp voice rang out like a slap in the face, mocking, taunting, savoring the attention she drew to herself as the glittering jewel of the evening. No one came to Samuel's defense. No one even looked at him with anything more than mild annoyance, as if his very existence had dared to tarnish the immaculate elegance of the night. Samuel stopped in a forgotten corridor backstage, a place where the rich perfumes and glittering gowns couldn't reach, and he gripped the handle of his cart so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His chest rose and fell with silent, controlled breaths. His heart, once trained to withstand the pressures of concert halls and roaring applause, now strained under a different weight, the heavy silence of being seen not as a man, but as a mistake. The faint scent of polished wood and fresh varnish filled his lungs, and the memories it triggered were almost unbearable. He closed his eyes. He saw flashes of another life, another stage, another piano that had once responded to his touch with the purity of love itself. But that life had ended long ago, buried under grief, regret, and a world too quick to forget. The sound of Vivian's laughter floated down the hall, light and cruel, slicing through Samuel's chest like a blade. Her words, dripping in condescension, stabbed deep. Imagine thinking you could ever understand real music. More laughter followed, brighter and harsher, and though Samuel had endured years of such quiet contempt, tonight it struck something he thought had long withered inside him. Not anger. Not pride. But memory. A memory of who he had been, and who he had promised never to betray, even when the world had turned away. Something shifted in Samuel Brooks at that moment, so subtle and yet so irreversible it was as if the ground itself had shifted beneath his feet. Without a word, he let go of the cleaning cart. It rolled forward on its squeaky wheels until it bumped against the wall with a soft thud, forgotten. Samuel straightened his shoulders, smoothed the old, worn cap over his silver hair, and turned toward the dazzling lights of the stage, no longer the dim corridor of the forgotten but the arena where he had once belonged. His steps were slow but deliberate as he approached the center of the grand sapphire hall. At first, no one noticed. Why would they? To them, he was a ghost, a shadow, someone who should have remained invisible. But when Samuel paused at the gleaming Bosendorfer, when his rough hands reached out once more, when he slid the piano bench back with a soft, determined scrape against the polished floor, heads began to turn. Confused murmurs stirred the air like a rising storm. Vivian, standing nearest to the stage, froze mid-conversation. Her blue eyes, moments ago sparkling with the arrogance of triumph, widened in disbelief as she realized what was happening. Her voice, sharp and shrill, broke through the mounting silence. Stop. You don't belong there. Get away from that piano. Samuel did not flinch. He did not even lift his head toward her. The disdain in her voice was a distant, meaningless noise compared to the roaring silence inside him, the ocean of memories, of music, of love and grief and humanity that could no longer be chained inside his chest. He sat down at the piano, his movements slow, reverent, filled with the same gravity as a man standing at the edge of the sea after a lifetime away. Vivian took a step forward, her fists clenched at her sides, her cheeks burning with rage and embarrassment, but before she could speak again, Samuel's fingers pressed lightly against the keys. One note, just one, rang out into the hall, pure and piercing and achingly beautiful. The sound seemed to suspend the very air, as if time itself had caught its breath. Every conversation halted mid-sentence, every chuckle died on the tongue, every eye turned toward the stage. The janitor had played a note more sincere, more soul-stirring, than anything any of them had produced all evening. Vivian opened her mouth to shout, to order him off stage, but no sound came. The note vibrated in her chest, gentle and merciless, tearing through her carefully constructed walls of superiority. The audience, the prodigies, the critics, they sat frozen, unable to look away, trapped by the power of something they could not yet understand but instinctively knew was real. And then, with the calm patience of a man who had waited a lifetime, Samuel Brooks began to play. Samuel Brooks's hands hovered over the keys for a breathless second longer, and then the music poured out of him, soft at first, like a whisper returning after years of silence. His fingers, though aged and rough, moved with a grace that no lesson could teach, a grace born from living, losing, and remembering. The first gentle notes slipped into the air, curling through the stunned hall like tendrils of smoke, delicate yet undeniable, reaching into corners where even arrogance had no refuge. No one moved. No one even dared to breathe. The music grew, slowly at first, like a flower unfolding in sunlight, each note weaving into the next with such effortless beauty that it felt less like he was playing and more like he was simply revealing something that had always been hidden inside the world, waiting for someone brave enough to set it free. The melodies rose and fell, carrying the weight of 1,000 emotions: joy, sorrow, longing, hope, feelings too deep and too real to be captured by words. Only music could carry them, and Samuel carried them effortlessly, pouring them out with every stroke of the keys. Vivian Lancaster stood rooted to the floor, her heart pounding in her chest in a way she had never known. The notes seemed to wrap around her, stripping away the cold armor she had built around herself, whispering truths she did not want to hear. Her fingers twitched helplessly at her sides, the ghost of her own training, her own performances, trembling in comparison to what she now witnessed. She had mastered every piece she had ever touched. She had played with flawless technique, perfect precision. But never had she played like this. Because what Samuel was creating wasn't a performance. It was a confession. It was a prayer. It was a life, laid bare without shame or pretense. The audience, rows and rows of finely dressed patrons, leaned forward in their seats, eyes wide, breaths caught. The critics who had sharpened their pens for the evening now sat motionless, their notepads forgotten in their laps. Even the youngest prodigies, full of ambition and dreams of fame, could not tear their eyes away. The spell was too complete, the music too honest. Samuel closed his eyes as he played, not because he needed to, but because it allowed him to feel every note more clearly. He was not playing to impress. He was not playing to prove anything. He was remembering, he was grieving, he was loving all at once, and so deeply that it seeped into every sound that rose from the piano. His hands did not falter, though they trembled with the rawness of emotion, not with weakness. His heart guided every motion, every pause, every tender brush of the keys. As the music swelled, tears welled in the eyes of those who had mocked him just minutes before. They wiped them away quickly, ashamed, but unable to deny the power that had taken hold of them. In the balcony, an old music professor who had once taught Vivian in her earliest lessons sat with his mouth slightly open, a tear tracing a silent path down his cheek. He had heard the greatest pianists of the century, and yet, tonight, this was what he would remember when he thought of music and its meaning. The melody shifted again, deepening, turning mournful yet beautiful, like the aching sadness of remembering something precious you can never touch again. It was the sound of goodbyes left unsaid, of dreams quietly folded away, of a heart that had loved so deeply it could still sing even after being broken. Vivian could feel her own throat tighten. She tried to look away, to harden herself, but the music would not allow it. It was merciless in its tenderness, brutal in its honesty. It demanded she listen, not just with her ears, but with the parts of herself she had kept locked away, the parts that feared vulnerability, that equated love with weakness. And slowly, inevitably, something inside her began to break. Not a violent shattering, but a slow, painful cracking, the way winter ice splits when spring finally forces it to yield. On stage, Samuel's body moved with the music, swaying slightly, as if carried by an invisible current. He was not an old man anymore. He was timeless. Ageless. He was simply music itself, incarnate, singing out to every wounded, hardened, forgotten heart in the room. The final notes approached like a setting sun, golden and slow, a promise of peace and forgiveness. Samuel's hands, trembling but steady, drew the last melody out of the piano with aching gentleness, a parting kiss to the soul of every listener. As the final note lingered in the hall, fading into a silence deeper and heavier than any sound, Samuel lowered his hands into his lap. And for a long, long moment, no one moved. No applause. No coughing. No whispering. Only silence rich, holy, and heavy with the weight of what had just happened. Vivian Lancaster stood frozen, her hands clasped tightly together to stop them from shaking, her bright blue eyes shining with something she could not yet name. She stared at the old man at the piano, the man she had dismissed as nothing just minutes ago, and realized with painful clarity that she had witnessed something extraordinary. Something her flawless technique had never given her. Something her lineage, her fame, her awards had never even touched. And slowly, like the first hesitant drop before the flood, a single tear escaped down her cheek. The hall remained suspended in that sacred silence, as if afraid that even a breath might break the fragile magic Samuel had woven. At the center of it all sat the janitor, head bowed, hands still resting lightly on the piano, no pride on his face, no triumph. Only peace. And in that moment, everyone understood. Tonight, history had been made not by glittering fame, not by polished arrogance, but by a heart that remembered how to sing. The silence inside Sapphire Music Hall hung heavier than velvet, stretching thin across the grand chandelier-lit ceiling, wrapping itself around every breathless chest. Samuel Brooks sat still at the Bosendorfer, his hands resting softly on the polished keys, not moving, not seeking applause, as if he had always known applause was not the reward he sought. In the front row, an elderly music critic wiped his glasses, trembling hands unable to steady the overwhelming emotion that blurred his vision. In the back, a young girl gripped her mother's sleeve, whispering, "Mommy, that music, it made me feel everything." Vivian Lancaster stood frozen just beyond the wings, her body stiff, her throat tight, her eyes wide with the dawning horror of realization. The man she had mocked, shamed, humiliated so effortlessly before hundreds, had just played a piece that shattered every illusion she had built about what it meant to be an artist, what it meant to truly feel. And yet, the silence deepened. Until the sound of heels sharp, decisive broke through the tension like a crack in glass. Heads turned, and out of the shadows emerged a woman, dressed in a dark navy suit so sharply cut it seemed to command the very space around her. Her hair was swept into a tight chignon, and her face bore the unmistakable calm of someone used to commanding respect. She walked with purpose, every step echoing against the marble floor, drawing the collective gaze of the stunned audience. Vivian turned, confused, her heart pounding. She didn't know this woman. No one seemed to. But the weight of her presence silenced even the whispers that had begun to stir among the seats. The woman climbed the steps to the stage without hesitation, stopping beside Samuel. Her eyes, dark and piercing, looked at him not with judgment, not with pity but with something far deeper, reverence. When she spoke, her voice was clear and carried across the hall with the authority of truth itself. "Forgive me for interrupting," she said, her gaze sweeping over the gathered crowd. "But I can no longer allow this night to pass without revealing the truth." The audience, still shell-shocked, leaned forward almost as one. For 20 years, the woman continued, the world of music has mourned the disappearance of a legend. A man whose gift touched thousands, whose performances graced the most prestigious halls from New York to Vienna. A man whose hands told stories no words ever could. She turned back to Samuel, her voice softening. "And tonight, without warning, he returned to us." The name she spoke next seemed to shatter the very air. Samuel Brooks, formerly known to the world as Samuel Ellington, the principal pianist of the New York Symphony Orchestra. The gasp that rose from the audience was like a wave breaking stunned, disbelieving, visceral. Vivian felt her knees weaken, a sharp tremor running through her arms. Her heart thundered painfully against her ribs. She stared at Samuel, at the old man she had mocked so casually, so viciously, and could hardly comprehend what she saw. Memories flooded her mind, the posters she had once admired in music history classes, the stories of a man whose talent had been called transcendent, whose performances had been spoken of in hushed, reverent tones. And all along, he had been here. A janitor. Invisible. The woman's voice softened again, filled with a sorrow that matched the one etched into Samuel's tired frame. For years, the world believed he had simply disappeared without a trace after the tragic death of his daughter, Emily. Few knew the depth of his grief. Fewer still understood that losing her meant losing the music inside him. He chose silence over stardom. Solitude over applause. Until tonight. Every eye was now fixed not on the woman, not on Vivian, but on Samuel Ellington, who sat quietly, his expression unreadable, as if none of this mattered, as if he were still just the old janitor pushing a cart through shining marble halls. Vivian pressed her hand against her mouth, shame burning so hot across her skin that she thought she might faint. Her chest tightened painfully. Tears blurred her vision again, but this time they weren't tears of awe. They were tears of guilt. Of overwhelming, soul-crushing regret. The woman stepped back slightly, offering the space to Samuel as if presenting a king before his court. And still he did not speak. He simply lifted his gaze, those deep, ancient eyes, and let them sweep slowly across the sea of stunned faces, stopping at Vivian for just a fraction of a heartbeat. There was no anger there. No bitterness. Only a deep, infinite sadness and, somehow, a forgiveness too profound for words. The moment passed like a fragile breath. Samuel finally stood, his movements slow but steady, his back straight despite the years weighing on it. He bowed slightly, not out of obligation, but out of the unshakable grace that had always been a part of him. And without saying a word, he stepped away from the piano. As he descended the stage steps, the audience parted like water, no one daring to speak, no one daring to move. Eyes followed him with reverence, as if watching a relic of something sacred leaving their midst. Vivian stood there, frozen, the magnitude of her mistake crushing down on her chest with the force of an avalanche. She had seen herself as a queen among the lesser, and yet she had failed to recognize true greatness when it stood quietly before her. Samuel Ellington had taught her something no polished concerto, no shiny trophy, no glowing review ever could. And for the first time in her life, Vivian Lancaster understood what it truly meant to be small. Vivian Lancaster stood frozen at the edge of the stage, the polished floor cold beneath her trembling feet, her chest tightening until she could barely draw breath. Around her, the audience remained seated in stunned silence, some still dabbing at their eyes, others staring blankly at the empty space Samuel Brooks had just walked through, as if unwilling to accept that he was no longer there. The Bosendorfer grand piano, gleaming under the stage lights, sat untouched, a silent witness to everything that had unraveled tonight. Vivian's heart pounded against her ribs, a chaotic, painful rhythm she couldn't control. She felt stripped, exposed, as if every cruel word she had ever spoken, every haughty glance she had ever given, was now scrawled in bright letters across her skin for all the world to see. The proud prodigy, the darling of critics and socialites, stood naked in her shame, and for the first time in her life, she had no defense, no polished smile to hide behind. She stumbled forward, her heels clicking awkwardly against the stage floor, her mind a swirling storm of guilt and regret. She needed to find him. She needed to say something, anything, to make right what she had so thoughtlessly destroyed. The ornate curtains at the back of the hall swung slightly as a draft moved through them, and Vivian pushed through, not caring about the eyes that followed her, not caring that she left behind her carefully curated image. She moved blindly through the narrow backstage corridors, past confused staff and lingering performers, her hands brushing against the cold, rough walls for balance. Her breath came in shallow gasps, not from exertion but from the fear that she might be too late, that Samuel would vanish back into the shadows where she had once banished him without a second thought. Then, at the end of a dim hallway lined with unused props and forgotten scenery, she saw him. Samuel Brooks stood alone, his figure small and worn against the vast emptiness. His back was to her, his shoulders slightly slumped, His hands, those hands that had just moments ago conjured the purest music she had ever heard, resting quietly at his sides. Vivian stopped several feet behind him, suddenly paralyzed by the enormity of what she was about to do. Her throat ached with unshed tears, and when she opened her mouth to speak, no words came out. It was as if her voice, trained and perfected for public adoration, had abandoned her when she needed it most. Samuel turned slowly, sensing her presence, his face as calm and composed as ever, but in his eyes, Vivian saw something that shattered her all over again understanding. There was no hatred in his gaze, no bitterness. Only a quiet sorrow, and worse, a compassion that made her shame burn even hotter. "I'm sorry," she finally choked out, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I didn't know. I didn't." Samuel shook his head gently, silencing her without words. He stepped closer, the lines of his face illuminated by the faint backstage light, and for a long moment, they simply stood there, the fallen prodigy and the forgotten master, two souls bound together by the mistakes of pride and the fragile, stubborn hope of redemption. "You saw only what you were taught to see," Samuel said softly, his voice low and steady, carrying no accusation, only truth. "It is easy to judge when you believe you are standing higher than others. Harder to listen. Harder to see." Vivian dropped her gaze, tears spilling freely now, staining the front of her shimmering gown. She had thought herself superior. She had thought perfection was something you could polish, rehearse, display. But tonight, Samuel had shown her that true greatness did not glitter or demand attention. It spoke in whispers. It moved in silence. It reached into places she had never dared to look. "I was wrong," she whispered, her voice trembling. "About you. About everything." Samuel smiled then, a small, sad smile that crinkled the corners of his tired eyes. He reached out, resting a weathered hand gently on her shoulder, and in that simple, human touch, Vivian felt something loosen inside her, something that had been bound tight for so long she hadn't even realized it was strangling her. "It is not wrong to strive for excellence," he said. "But when you close your heart in the pursuit of it, you lose the very music you seek to create." His words, simple and profound, wrapped around her broken spirit, offering not condemnation, but a way forward. A way to begin again. Vivian nodded slowly, the weight of her arrogance, her blindness, pressing down on her but not crushing her. Samuel's forgiveness, freely given, became a lifeline, fragile but strong enough to hold on to. "I want to do better," she said, her voice steadier now, though tears still ran freely down her cheeks. "I don't want to be that person anymore." Samuel squeezed her shoulder gently before letting go, his smile softening into something warmer, something filled with hope. "Then begin," he said simply. "Music, true music, will find you when your heart is ready." And with that, he turned and walked away, his steps slow but sure, leaving Vivian standing alone in the quiet backstage hallway, clutching the words he had given her like a precious, fragile gift. For the first time in her life, Vivian Lancaster didn't feel like a star, or a prodigy, or a legend in the making. She felt human. And in that humbling, painful, beautiful moment, she understood that it was only from this place stripped of arrogance, laid bare by truth, that real music, and real life, could finally begin. Vivian Lancaster stood alone backstage, the echoes of Samuel's parting words lingering around her like a fragile, invisible song. Her heart beat heavily in her chest, but for the first time, it was not from fear of failing or desperate ambition. It was something different now, something raw and unfamiliar, the deep, urgent need to be true. Not perfect. Not admired. Just true. Beyond the thick velvet curtains, the grand hall remained in a tense, waiting silence. The audience hadn't moved, as if the soul-stirring moment they had witnessed demanded stillness, reverence. The Grand Bosendorfer still sat gleaming under the lights, untouched, as if waiting for another story to be told, another truth to be revealed. Vivian wiped the tears from her cheeks, her fingers trembling slightly. Every part of her body wanted to run, to disappear into the safety of anonymity, to avoid facing the consequences of her arrogance. But deeper still, beneath the fear, something stronger stirred. A new, fragile kind of courage. The courage to face herself, without masks, without applause. Slowly, she took a step forward. The corridor seemed endless, the polished floor stretching before her like a path she was only now worthy to walk. She passed familiar faces, stagehands, fellow prodigies, a few professors, but none dared to speak. They watched her in silent witness, understanding that something had shifted, something too profound to name. With each step, Vivian shed the layers she had wrapped herself in for so long, the arrogance, the superiority, the coldness. When she finally reached the side of the stage, she paused, breathing deeply, feeling her heart race not from the pressure to perform but from the sheer vulnerability of stepping forward without any armor left. The stage manager gave her a questioning look, uncertain whether he should send her out again. Vivian simply nodded once, a small, steady motion, and the heavy curtain began to rise. As she stepped onto the stage, a ripple of surprise moved through the audience. Whispers stirred, curious, uncertain. Vivian crossed to the center, her blue gown trailing like a pool of water behind her, and stood before the grand piano. The same piano she had once claimed as her throne. The same piano Samuel Brooks had transformed into a vessel of pure truth. She lowered herself onto the bench, her fingers hovering uncertainly over the keys. The lights bore down on her, but this time, they didn't feel like spotlights demanding perfection. They felt warm. Forgiving. Vivian closed her eyes, shutting out everything, the wealth, the expectations, the judges, the past. She let the fear wash over her, then let it go, feeling it drain from her body like a weight finally lifted. In the stillness of her own mind, she remembered Samuel's voice. Let your heart guide you. She placed her hands gently on the keys, and she began to play. The first few notes were hesitant, searching, as if groping for a path in the dark. They were not perfectly crisp. They were not technically brilliant. But they were real. Honest. And that honesty flowed outward, wrapping itself around the room like the slow unfolding of a long-hidden sunrise. The audience, startled by the fragility of the opening, leaned forward instinctively. This was not the Vivian Lancaster they knew. This was not the cold, flawless prodigy who played like a machine. This was a girl, a young woman laying bare her heart in the only language she had ever truly known but never dared to speak properly until now. As the music grew, so did her confidence. Not the confidence of technique, but the confidence of truth. Her fingers moved more freely, weaving melodies that carried regret, hope, apology, and an aching longing for forgiveness. Every mistake she had ever made, every harsh word, every false smile, it all poured out of her through the notes, raw and unpolished and beautiful beyond words. Vivian felt tears on her face again, but this time, she didn't wipe them away. She let them fall, staining the keys, joining the music. Her entire body played now, not just her hands, but her trembling shoulders, her heaving chest, her breaking, healing heart. In the audience, people wept openly. Parents held their children tighter. Critics set down their pens, no longer concerned with reviews but simply grateful to witness something so achingly real. And somewhere backstage, Samuel Brooks listened too, standing unseen, his old hands folded loosely behind his back, a quiet smile of pride playing on his lips. He did not need to see her to know. He could hear it in every note, in every breath between the notes, the transformation he had hoped for. Vivian played on, no longer afraid of wrong notes, no longer afraid of imperfection. She embraced every tremble, every stumble, letting them become part of the story she was telling. And through that acceptance, she created something infinitely more perfect than perfection itself. When the final chord rang out a soft, bittersweet goodbye, Vivian let her hands fall into her lap, her body spent, her soul poured out into the hall. She kept her eyes closed, too afraid to see the faces, too raw to endure their judgment. But what came next wasn't judgment. It was silence, deep, profound, reverent. And then, slowly at first, a single pair of hands clapping. Then another. And another. Until the hall erupted in a standing ovation that was not just for her music, but for her courage, her humility, her rebirth. Vivian opened her eyes to a blur of faces, shining with tears and pride, and though the applause was deafening, it was the softest sound she heard that mattered most. A quiet voice from somewhere in the crowd, spoken in wonder. She finally found it. Vivian bowed low, not with the rigid grace of old performances, but with deep gratitude, feeling the truth of that moment settle into her very bones. She had found it. And this was only the beginning. The thunderous applause filled every corner of the Sapphire Music Hall, vibrating through the velvet seats, the marble floors, and the golden chandeliers that trembled slightly under the force of it. Vivian Lancaster stood motionless at the center of the stage, the heavy weight of emotion pressing against her chest. She clutched the fabric of her gown tightly at her sides, not out of fear anymore, but because she was holding herself together, trying to absorb this moment, a moment she had never dreamed would feel like this. This was not applause for a polished prodigy or a flawless performance. It was applause for something raw, human, and painfully real. Vivian lifted her head slowly, scanning the faces before her not the way she used to, seeking approval, validation, admiration, but simply seeing them, feeling the collective heartbeat they now shared. In every tearful gaze, in every trembling smile, she saw reflections of her own brokenness, her own healing. And somewhere at the edge of the stage, half concealed behind the heavy curtains, she caught a glimpse of Samuel Brooks. He stood there, silent, his hands folded gently before him, his face calm and proud, but his eyes, those deep, kind eyes, gleamed with something that made Vivian's throat tighten all over again. He nodded to her once, a small, almost imperceptible gesture. It was all she needed. Vivian turned back to the microphone at the center of the stage. She stood still for a moment, letting the applause fade naturally, not forcing it, not demanding silence, but waiting patiently, humbly until the hall itself seemed to hold its breath again. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, unsteady at first, but clear enough to carry into the expectant hush. "I don't deserve your applause," she began, the honesty of her words slicing through the stillness like the first light at dawn. "Not after tonight. Not after what I've learned about myself." A murmur ran through the audience, but no one interrupted. No one dared to. Vivian took a shaky breath and continued, her hands no longer clenched but open at her sides, her heart exposed. "Tonight. I hurt someone. Someone who deserved only respect, someone who carries a heart greater than any of us can imagine. I judged him by what I saw, by what I thought was true. And in doing so, I revealed the ugliest parts of myself, parts one didn't even realize existed." Her voice cracked slightly, but she did not stop. "I thought perfection in technique was enough. I thought applause was proof of greatness. But Samuel Brooks." She paused, letting his name settle in the room like a sacred prayer. "He showed me that true greatness has nothing to do with fame, or skill, or flawless performances." She turned slightly, looking toward the shadows where Samuel stood. "Greatness," she said, her voice growing stronger, "is in kindness. It's in humility. It's in the courage to keep your heart open even when the world tries to crush it." Vivian faced the audience again, her bright blue eyes shining with unshed tears, her entire being trembling with the weight of the truth she now carried. "I wronged him," she whispered. "I wronged myself. And I'm sorry." The words hung there, fragile but unbreakable, the purest music she had ever offered. "I promise you," she said, her voice lifting, "I will never again play to impress. I will never again live to be admired. From this night forward, every note I play, every song I share, will come from my heart, not my ambition." Her chest heaved with the force of it, but for the first time, she didn't feel crushed beneath her emotions. She felt free. Vivian took a step back from the microphone, her body shaking with the enormity of the moment, and then without hesitation she lowered herself into a deep, sincere bow. Not the rehearsed, perfect bows she had practiced for competitions. Not the proud, shallow bows she had offered at galas and showcases. This was a bow of humility. A bow of gratitude. A bow of transformation. The hall remained silent for a heartbeat longer, as if savoring the miracle unfolding before them. And then, as if by some unspoken agreement, the applause began again, softer this time, deeper, not roaring but swelling, like the slow, unstoppable tide of the ocean rising to embrace the shore. Vivian rose from her bow, her face wet with tears she no longer tried to hide. She smiled a real, broken, beautiful smile, and for the first time, she felt light, not burdened by the expectations of others but lifted by the honesty now burning inside her. From the shadows, Samuel smiled too, a quiet pride shining in his eyes. He had not only saved a heart tonight. He had helped it be born anew. Vivian stepped back from the stage, her soul trembling but steady, and as she disappeared into the wings, the audience remained on their feet, clapping not for perfection, not for glamour, but for the young woman who had finally learned the true meaning of music, of life, of herself. And somewhere in the quietness of her heart, Vivian knew, this was only the beginning. As Vivian Lancaster stepped off the grand stage, her heart still trembling from the weight of everything she had confessed, the world behind the velvet curtain seemed strangely still. The echo of the audience's applause faded slowly into a deep, reverent hush, and for a fleeting moment, it was as if the entire universe held its breath, unwilling to break the fragile, sacred silence that had fallen over Sapphire Music Hall. Vivian moved quietly down the dimly lit backstage corridor, her gown brushing softly against the floor, her footsteps light but unsteady. Her chest still ached with the rawness of what she had shared, but there was something new blossoming inside her too, something bright, painful, and beautiful all at once, a fragile hope that forgiveness, both from others and from herself, might just be possible. She searched the shadows, her eyes straining, her heart longing for one face, one person without whom none of this transformation would have been possible. Samuel Brooks. But he was nowhere to be seen. Panic flickered briefly through her chest, an urgent need to find him, to say the words she hadn't yet spoken, the words that no public apology could ever fully capture. She quickened her steps, weaving through the narrow backstage maze where stagehands and musicians still stood clustered in small, hushed groups, parting silently as she passed, their faces filled with a mixture of awe and something even rarer, respect. At the far end of a narrow hallway, near the service exit where the cold night air seeped through the old brick walls, she finally caught a glimpse of him. Samuel stood by the heavy side door, his familiar gray uniform blending almost completely into the shadows, his back slightly bowed, his cap pulled low over his silver hair. In his right hand, he held his old cleaning cart, once more the same battered cart that had been his silent companion through years of invisible labor. Vivian froze. 1,000 words tumbled inside her, but none seemed enough. Nothing could erase the cruelty she had once shown him. Nothing could undo the years he had spent unnoticed, uncelebrated, carrying the weight of a grief too heavy for any man to bear. But Samuel turned before she could move, as if he had felt her presence without needing to see her. Their eyes met across the dim corridor. Vivian opened her mouth to speak, but Samuel lifted a gentle hand not to silence her, but to reassure her. His eyes, deep pools of sorrow and wisdom, spoke for him. There was no anger there. No bitterness. Only peace. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture so simple and yet so full of meaning that it made Vivian's throat tighten painfully. She understood without words, he had already forgiven her. He had forgiven her before she had even found the strength to forgive herself. Samuel shifted his cart slightly, the wheels squeaking softly in the quiet, and turned back toward the door. For a moment, Vivian thought he might say something, offer some final words of guidance or farewell. But he didn't. He didn't need to. Everything that mattered had already been said, not in speeches or grand gestures, but in music, in truth, in the silent, painful beauty of shared humanity. With one final, quiet glance over his shoulder, Samuel Brooks, the man the world had forgotten, the man who had once stood at the pinnacle of greatness and had chosen instead the humility of solitude, pushed open the heavy service door and stepped into the cold night beyond. The door swung gently for a moment before settling shut with a soft, definitive click. And he was gone. Vivian stood motionless, her heart breaking and mending at once, the enormity of his departure sinking into her bones. He had left with the same grace he had carried through every note he played, every burden he bore. Without fanfare. Without regret. Without asking anything in return. Only leaving behind the gift he had given her, a gift more precious than any trophy, more enduring than any applause. The gift of remembering what truly mattered. Slowly, Vivian wiped her tears with the back of her hand, squaring her shoulders not out of pride, but out of a deep resolve. Samuel's departure was not an ending. It was a beginning, a challenge laid at her feet, a quiet, powerful call to live differently, to play differently, to be different. And she would answer it. She would carry his music forward, not through flawless performances, but through honesty, through humility, through the kind of strength that could only be born from compassion. As she turned and made her way back through the labyrinth of corridors, she realized something profound: greatness was never about being seen, about being celebrated. Greatness was about touching others so deeply that even when you walked away, your song continued to echo in their hearts. Samuel Brooks, Samuel Ellington, would not be forgotten. Not by her. Not by anyone who had been there that night. Vivian paused briefly at the edge of the stage once more, looking out over the emptying hall bathed in soft golden light, and smiled through her tears. "Thank you, Mr. Brooks. Thank you for everything." And as the last of the audience filed out into the night, leaving only the lingering memory of something too beautiful to ever be fully captured in words, the music he had gifted them, the truth he had awakened, lived on. In every heart he had touched. In every soul he had stirred. And most of all, in the young woman who would never again play a single note without remembering the janitor who had taught her the true meaning of greatness. Years passed, but that night at the Sapphire Music Hall never faded from Vivian Lancaster's memory. It became the quiet axis around which her entire life turned, the moment when the course of her existence shifted irreversibly, not with a thunderous announcement, but with a single, aching melody played by a man the world had tried to forget. Vivian's fame did not vanish after that night. If anything, it grew, but it grew differently, shaped by a new kind of reverence. She no longer pursued the hollow glow of admiration. She no longer measured her worth by trophies, reviews, or the silent nods of elite patrons. She measured it by the quiet spaces she could reach, the wounded hearts she could touch, just as Samuel Brooks had once touched hers without a single word. Her performances changed. Critics, once eager to describe her technique with clinical precision, now struggled to put into words what they heard. They spoke instead of being moved, of being broken open and pieced back together again. Audiences no longer came simply to watch a prodigy. They came to feel. And everywhere she went, no matter how grand the stage, Vivian carried a small photo tucked inside the inner pocket of her concert dress, a worn, black and white image of an old man in a janitor's uniform, sitting quietly at a grand piano, his eyes closed, his soul wide open. She had found the photo once, abandoned backstage in the dusty archives of the hall. She had claimed it without hesitation, as if fate had placed it there for her alone. She played for him. She lived for him. And through her, his music lived on. Vivian never spoke publicly of Samuel Brooks, Samuel Ellington, as the world would later rediscover, not out of shame, but out of a fierce, sacred respect. His story was not hers to exploit. It was hers to protect. Hers to honor. But in small, quiet ways, she let his spirit guide her. After every performance, while the glittering crowd celebrated, she would slip away to the back of the hall, find a quiet worker, a janitor, a technician, a stagehand, and thank them personally, sincerely, humbly. And when she taught young musicians, she did not begin with scales or posture or hand positioning. She began with silence. With listening. With the gentle, sometimes painful act of opening one's heart before ever touching a key. "Technique will carry you to the stage," she would say softly, "but only love will carry you into another soul." The students would nod, some not understanding yet, some feeling a flicker of something deeper stir within them. And that was enough. Vivian built scholarships for students who could not afford lessons, opened small community centers in neglected neighborhoods where battered pianos found new life under young, trembling hands. She visited prisons and orphanages, playing not for recognition, but for those whose stories mirrored the unseen grief Samuel had once carried inside him. And sometimes, after a concert ended, when the last note still hung faintly in the air, Vivian would linger on the stage alone, her fingers gently pressing one final chord into the silence. Not for the audience. Not for herself. But for him. For the man who had taught her, without ever seeking anything in return, the most beautiful truth of all. That music was not perfection. Music was mercy. One evening, many years later, after a particularly stirring performance in a small coastal town where the salty air made every note feel like a prayer, a young girl with trembling hands approached Vivian backstage, clutching a program signed in shaky ink. Her eyes were wide, filled with tears, and she could barely form the words. "Miss Lancaster," she stammered, voice cracking, "when you played tonight. I felt like I wasn't invisible anymore." Vivian knelt to meet the girl's eyes, placing her hands gently on the child's shoulders, steady and warm. "You were never invisible," she said, smiling through her own tears. "You just needed someone to remind you." And as she hugged the girl, holding her close against the battered fabric of a life rebuilt through humility, Vivian thought of Samuel Brooks the janitor, the legend, the man who had given her back her own soul. She knew he was gone, long gone now, vanished back into the quiet world he had always preferred. No statues would be erected in his honor. No grand monuments would bear his name. But he lived. In every broken heart mended through music. In every lost soul reminded of their worth. In every trembling note played not for glory, but for love. As Vivian stood once more before a small, humble piano backstage, her fingers brushing the worn ivory keys, she closed her eyes and let the first note drift into the empty hall, soft, imperfect, and filled with everything she had ever wanted to say. Somewhere, in the quiet spaces beyond the lights, she imagined Samuel listening. And she smiled, knowing that the legacy of a single note, played with truth, could echo forever.